This is the second lecture in a two-lecture series on methodologies in psychology. You may recall that in our last lecture we talked extensively about experimentation and the experiment as a major tool for psychology and for science in general. And we said that one of the real advantages of experimentation was that it allowed a causal statement to be made, that you could manipulate an independent variable, measure a dependent variable, and make a causal statement that it was the independent variable that caused the change in the dependent variable. And that's very nice and a very powerful thing to be able to do. However, there are those who think that experimentation, particularly in psychology, has its problems. One of the problems is how artificial it is. You remember we were talking about, does violence on TV cause aggression in children? And what we did was take children and haul them into the laboratory and set them down in front of a TV set with 5 other children to watch this TV, and then we put them together to observe their behavior after that. Pretty artificial. That's not the way they watch TV at home. They in fact get a chance to choose their own TV, often at home, or at least their parents do. And then they sit there and they wander in and out of the room and sit down and change channels and all sorts of other different kinds of natural things happening. And to put them in this experimental context and constrain it the way we do, some people would say that it's pretty difficult to generalize from those kinds of experiments to the real life situation that's far more natural. So that's one of the criticisms of experimentation, even though it is a very powerful thing to be able to use. For that reason, people in psychology do other kinds of experimentation as well. Still on the quantitative side, and experimentation certainly is quantitative, we can generate numbers some other different ways as well. In fact, when I give that exercise I was just talking about in the last lecture about violence on television, I often have some folks who say, well, now we did something very different. In fact, what we wanted to do was send out a log to the parents to say what kinds of TV shows you're watching. So this log might say every half hour you have to write down what you watched in the previous half hour. So at 10:30 you have to say what shows were on your TV during that period of time. And even today, you could do it in a more automatically way by having some device on the TV that tells you what's been watched during that period of time. Some way you could collect data on what was being watched. And then you could take those data and compare it to some ratings you had for the amount of violence for each of those TV shows and get some sort of a number saying that this is the mean rating for those TV shows. For this particular family, it was a 6.3 perhaps, and for another family it might be a 4.7, something like that. And then what we're going to do is try to get some measure of the aggressiveness of the child. And so we're going to do some things like ask their teacher, give us a rating on how aggressive you think that child is on a 10-point scale. Or perhaps you could say how many trips to the principal's office the child has had, or how many trips to juvenile center the child has had. Get some measure of aggressiveness of the child as well. And then what you can do is plot that on what's often called a scatter plot. So on one axis you might have, say on the vertical axis, you might have how aggressive the child is. And on the horizontal axis you might have something like how violent the average TV show that child watched. And so for Jack, you have down here a 4.7 for how violent it was, and you go up and you have a 6.3 on how aggressive Jack is. And so you put a point there. And then for Susie, you come in here and maybe it's a 4.2 and a 5.1, and you put a point there. And for Juan, it's a 7.1, and you get the idea. And so you end up with this graph with a scatter plot with points representing each data point is at one of the children, and how average violence was for that TV show, or for the TV watching, and how aggressive that child is. And from that, you can try to determine whether there's a relationship between aggression and violence. And in order to do that, we usually do a statistical test of some sort. And probably most of you are familiar with correlations. And what you figure out is a correlation coefficient, which is the result of the statistical test. We won't go into any great detail. There are different correlation coefficients depending upon whether it's a linear relationship or a curvilinear relationship and so forth. But for the most part, you get a single number from this, and that number goes from 0 to 1 and is either positive or negative. A correlation coefficient of 1 would indicate that there's a perfect relationship between these two. In fact, every data point would fall on a straight line for this particular correlation coefficient. Now, you never get that in reality, but that's the ideal if you found a perfect relationship. And then the less perfect the relationship, it would go down to 0. 0 would indicate no relationship between the two variables. It would look like a shotgun pattern or something like that, where there was no discernible trend line in these data points. And you would have either a positive or negative sign attached to this number. A positive sign would indicate that it was a relationship where one variable increased, the other variable increased as well. So the more violence on the TV, the more aggression there was. A negative would indicate that the relationship was the opposite, that is, one increased, the other one decreased. So that gives us some idea of the strength of the relationship and the direction of the relationship from the correlation coefficient. However, I should point out that this is just a relationship. Suppose I asked you whether that meant, suppose we found a positive relationship. Suppose it was 0.73 or something like that, positive 0.73. And so we see that there is a relationship between the violent TV shows and the amount of aggression. Does that mean that the violent TV shows caused the aggressive behavior? And I would hope you'd say, no, it doesn't. You have not done an experiment here. This is called a correlational observation. And when you do a correlational observation, you have not manipulated an independent variable. I've not independently assigned anything in that thing I just described, that piece of research I just described. They decided what TV shows to watch, or their parents did. It was a behavior, not something I set at a particular level. They decided to do it. And aggressiveness, I didn't set that, surely. That's a behavior as well. They behaved that way, the teachers rated them, and so forth. So they're both really dependent variables. We don't have an independent variable in that correlational observation. And when you don't have an independent variable, you don't have an experiment. And if you don't have an experiment, you cannot make a causal statement from that experiment. All you can say is that they're related, at least from a single piece of research like that. You can do multiple pieces of research, we'll talk about that in a minute, and get some idea that perhaps it's causal. Now, why is that? Why are the rules of science, we said that it was just a rule of science, that you do an experiment, you can make a causal statement, but I just told you it was a rule of science that you can't do that with a correlational observation. Why not? Well, there are several problems with using a correlational observation and trying to infer causality. One of those problems is a directionality problem. You don't know which variable caused the other variable to change. It could be, in the case, let's say, of aggression and violence, maybe the more aggressive the kid is, the more violent TV show they watch. All right? So, in fact, we got a real aggressive kid here. Johnny's an 8 on aggression, and Johnny loves those shoot-'em-up kind of shows on television. So he watches the more aggressive shows. And you have little Kenny down here who loves the nature shows on television and Sesame Street and that sort of thing. And he hardly has any problems with aggression. Okay, so it's the amount of aggressiveness that's causing the violent TV show, not the other way around. We got the directionality wrong. So that's one possible problem. A second problem can be a third variable that's entering into this. So it may be, for example, the aggressiveness of the parents that's causing both of this. Aggressive parents like watching violent TV shows. And aggressive parents tend to treat their kids perhaps more punitively. So they punish their kids more, they spank their kids more. Maybe it's the aggressiveness of the parents that's causing both of these things. And that's the causality, not one of these causing the other one. Now, to illustrate that a little bit, let me tell you about a few cases where it's even clearer that there may be either directionality or a second variable kind of problem. One time the U.S. government, the military, was interested in what caused motorcycle accidents among the GIs. They were concerned with minimizing motorcycle accidents. And so they went in and did a study, and it was a correlational observation. And they sent out questionnaires, and they plugged in a lot of things. How old are you? What's your driving record like? Are you a man or a woman? And so forth. And so they collected a lot of data to try to see what they could do in terms of predicting motorcycle accidents. And you know what the number one predictor of motorcycle accidents was? It was how many tattoos the GI had. The more tattoos the GI had, the more motorcycle accidents the GI had. Now, what are we to conclude from this? Are we to conclude that tattoos cause motorcycle accidents? Are we to conclude that motorcycle accidents cause tattoos? I don't think either of those is a very good hypothesis in this case. It's probably some third variable again. Perhaps preference for bodily risk or something like that that's driving both of these. The more I'm willing to risk my body and hang it out on the motorcycle, the more I'm willing to risk it and have these tattoos that may cause their own kind of problems. So these two things are related through a third variable. If you look at a cigarette pack, on the side of the cigarette pack it says very clearly now that smoking causes health problems. And it has various versions of that. I remember far enough back that there were no warning labels on cigarette packs. And I remember an intermediate stage where there was a warning that said, smoking may cause health problems. Now, how did we get from no warning to a causal statement that smoking causes health problems? The problem was, of course, that it was very difficult to do an experiment. You can't tell a group of people, suppose you get a group of 500 people together and you say, all right, you're not allowed to smoke for the next 20 years. And another group of 500, you say, you smoke 1 pack of cigarettes a day, exactly, for the next 20 years. And another group, you smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day for the next 20 years. That's an experiment. It's an independent variable. We manipulated it, in this case, at 3 levels. Nice experiment. But unfortunately, maybe fortunately, they won't let us do that. We're not allowed to dictate to people how much they can smoke. That's a personal choice. So we can't do that experiment. You can do some experiments perhaps with mice and force them to smoke and that sort of thing, but there's always the problem of generalizing from an animal model to a human model. And so those data had to be looked at with some care. And the only other data that were available were correlational observations. And it was known for some time that there was a correlational observation that one thing was related to the other thing. So that we knew many years ago that people who smoked more had more health problems. But you couldn't make the causal statement from a single correlational observation. There may be some third factor that's entering into this again. Maybe people who are more nervous tend to have more health problems. They're high-strung folks, and they smoke more cigarettes. Maybe that's it. Maybe people who are less health conscious. They don't go to the doctor as much. They have more health problems because they don't seek personal care for their health. And perhaps they also smoke more because they're less concerned about their health. So there may be some third factor that's driving both of these. And so that's, again, an illustration of where we got from a correlational observation to a causal statement. The only way they actually got there was to eliminate all of the other possible third factors through doing even more correlational observation. But it was a whole series of these that was required to even begin to make the causal statement. And even then, there was a lot of flack from the cigarette companies when they wanted to make the causal statement, even after looking at all of these correlational observations. Surveys are usually done with correlational data. So I'm sure everybody's taken a survey. You may be asked to, from 1 to 7, say how much you agree with a particular statement on a survey. and those are certainly quantitative. We can add up those numbers, take means and that sort of thing. But in the end, all we have are correlational observations from surveys. We've not, again, manipulated any independent variable, and so we can't do anything other than make correlational observations from those surveys. Surveys have some other kinds of advantages and disadvantages as well. An advantage is you can actually ask people what they think about things. Suppose you're interested in, you're working in a grocery store and you want to know how to display your products nicely. And so you do one sort of display, and then another day you try a different kind of display. And now you may discover that the first display, you sold more products than the second display. That would tell you something. It's kind of an experiment that you did there, but you don't know why. And so you might also pass out a survey and say, did you think it looked better? Why did you buy this product? So you can sort of crawl into their heads a little bit more with a survey. But again, there are some problems because all you get are their subjective opinions, and they certainly can lie to you about things. They may not know why they bought the product, in fact, or maybe buying the product was not particularly, it was a candy bar and they're trying to be health conscious, and so they might lie to you about why they bought that particular product, for example. So surveys have other kinds of problems as well, but they certainly have a problem of being only a correlational observation, and you can't make causal statements from it. Let me make one last comment about correlational observations before we move on to the other methodologies. People sometimes, if you read about these things in the newspaper, the article will get it right, but the headline will get it wrong, because the headline writer read the article and inferred causality where there was no causality in the study being talked about. So you get a headline, premarital sex causes bad grades in high school children, or something like that. And you read the article and they discover they did a survey, and they discovered that the kids who had premarital sex generally got lower grades, and they got a correlation on this basis, which is obviously a correlational observation. And then the headline writer wanted to spice it up a little bit, and so jumped to the case of one caused the other. The use of smoking causes the use of hard drugs. All these kinds of headlines that you might see, where if you look at the study, it was not causal at all. So be wary when you see headlines that imply causality when you're talking about human behavior, because very often they may be talking about correlational observations. All right, let's move on then to the qualitative techniques that are sometimes used in psychology. If I were giving this lecture 30 years ago, I wouldn't be talking about qualitative methods at all in psychology. These are fairly recent, and their acceptance is still somewhat tenuous by psychologists. The more hard-nosed experimenters, in fact, don't like qualitative data very much. But qualitative data are becoming more widely accepted in psychology, so we ought to at least be aware of that. Let me give you several kinds of qualitative data that can be produced, several different kinds of methodologies. There's a methodology called ethnography. And ethnography attempts to observe and collect data from those within a particular culture or undergoing a common experience of some sort. I have a faculty member in my department who studies mother-daughter relationships, which is a fairly interesting kind of topic. It turns out that mothers and daughters don't get along too well at particular times in life. And so she brings people in, both mothers and daughters, brings them into the laboratory, and then she interviews them. And she has some fairly structured questions that she asks them, but they can answer them in quite an open way. It's not like they're checking off a agree, disagree. It's not like it's just an oral version of a survey. In fact, these questions are asked, and then they may give a 5-minute answer to the question. And she tape records this, and after they leave the laboratory, she transcribes this. And she has various ways that are too technical to get into today of analyzing the data from these kinds of exchanges. And so she will analyze the data, put it into some different kinds of categories, for example, or do some actual analysis on the language used itself in order to better understand mother-daughter kinds of relationships. And that's ethnography at work, even in the laboratory. Ethnographers sometimes do things like set up focus groups, for example. Suppose I were a bank manager, and I'd put in all these ATM machines, and I thought that was the greatest thing that came along, and it was going to allow me to fire all my tellers and save a whole lot of money and make things quite efficient for my bank. And then I discovered that we have all sorts of people who are not using the ATM machines. They still want to come in and talk to a teller. And we don't know why that is. Now, you might do certain kinds of things to determine why that is. You might observe them trying to interact with the ATM machine or something like that. But one thing that you could do is set up a focus group. So you bring in some representative samples of people who use your bank, and you ask them what the problem is here. Why aren't you using the ATM? And some may say, well, I didn't feel safe using the ATM machine. It's not very well lit. There are not a lot of people around. I'm afraid I'm going to get robbed if I use the ATM machine. Others may say, you know, I really don't know how to use the ATM machine. I tried my best. I couldn't get my money out of it. What's worse, I don't know how to put my money in it. I still don't know where my deposit goes when I put it in there. I get no receipt back. I don't like using that ATM machine for that reason. And you get other kinds of responses like that, which are fairly open-ended kinds of responses, but you can analyze them and perhaps categorize them to some extent, and it will give you some idea why they're using your ATM machine or not. So that's a focus group that is used. Ethnographers can work in the laboratory or in the more natural setting, and when they start working in a more natural setting, in addition to calling it ethnography, we can call it naturalistic observation. And so they go to the particular place where the behavior is occurring and observe the behavior in a natural setting. And that's been done a number of different ways. For example, Jane Goodall, you probably are familiar with her work with chimpanzees. Jane Goodall observed chimpanzees for many years. And an example of the kind of findings she might find in a naturalistic setting, she discovered that there was one particular chimpanzee she saw who would take a twig and pull off all the leaves from the twig and stick this twig into a hole, and the ants would crawl in the twig, and then it'd lick all the ants off and stick it back in the hole and lick the ants off, and so forth. And this was the first indication that animals other than humans use tools. And it was done in a naturalistic setting where she was an unobtrusive observer in this setting, just watching the animals do this. Or you can, of course, do human behavior as well. I attended a conference about a month ago where Napoleon Chagnon, who's a very famous anthropologist, had spent about 30 years studying the Yanomama population in the Amazon. And he just moved in with them, lived with them, observed them, took extensive notes about their behavior, and he in the end, through ethnography, learned some very interesting things about this population. For example, people thought that if you study folks who don't have our modern day kinds of civilization, those folks would be fairly peaceful, sort of the noble savage model of what has been suggested by the philosophers many centuries ago, in fact, and which a lot of people like to believe. Margaret Mead was a very famous anthropologist who claimed that the noble savage was out there. And what Chagnon found with this particular population is that they were in fact very aggressive. There was a lot of killing that went on. The average male in this group, in fact, had participated in killing somebody else. And so this very much knocked down this noble savage concept, and he did it through ethnography, through living with these people, observing them. Okay, case history is another qualitative technique that is used in, as a methodology in psychology. Case histories are used for clinical cases. Freud, in fact, we'll talk about Freud in another lecture or two from now. And Freud extensively used case histories. His clinical case histories, in fact, form almost the entire basis of psychoanalytic theory. And it's one of the criticisms of psychoanalytic theory is that case histories are not very powerful research techniques. But sometimes they're the only thing that we have. I mean, you can't set up an experiment to cause a mental illness and then investigate the mental illness. You have to take it as it comes to you. Or any other kind of illness. One of the earliest cases in psychology of interest is a case of Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was a fellow who worked in the mining industry and was tamping in dynamite to blow up some rock. And the thing he was tamping with, which was a big, long rod, set off the dynamite, and it blew this rod right up through Phineas's skull and right through his brain. And amazingly enough, Phineas lived through this experience. People were amazed that this had happened. And then they studied Phineas very extensively to find out what the problem was. Because he could still walk around, he could still talk. What they found is the particular area of his brain that it went through, he turned into a very different person. Somebody who was quite irascible and quite aggressive and was not the pleasant fellow he was before this. Well, again, it's not ethical to cause somebody to have the kind of brain damage that Phineas Gage had. So you had to kind of take it where it was. And in that case histories are fairly important methodologies in psychology. Another thing that you can do is do critical incidents. These are case histories not so much of a person, but it's a case history of something that happened. They do this very often with aircraft accidents when they're trying to investigate what happens. And so they'll go in and collect a bunch of near misses where the accident didn't quite happen, but it almost happened. And then they'll bring these people in and do a critical incident analysis of it to find out what the conditions were as this incident was happening. And that is often informative as well. So these are all qualitative research techniques. And there are criticisms of these kinds of techniques. To begin with, none of them certainly are more than correlational observations at best. And in many cases, you don't even have the numbers that go along with correlational observations. So inferring causality is almost impossible with these kinds of studies. Secondly, if you don't really have numbers that you can rely on, how do you do statistical analyses on these kinds of data? And so a lot of the modern statistical analyses that save psychologists because they help to explain human variability are not applicable to these kinds of research, to this kind of research. And finally, there's a lot of subjectivity to these kinds of things. The experimenters or the researchers' bias in sitting there doing ethnography can certainly influence the kinds of data that are being collected. And when it's a case history, there's also often a problem with memory because you're talking about something that may have happened some time ago and the person has to remember. And memory, as we know, is somewhat suspect as well. Now, you don't have to rely on just one of these. You can do research that uses a number of different kinds, have a whole palette of different kinds of methodologies that can be used. Let me give you one quick example. There were people who are interested in motorcycle accidents and why people have motorcycle accidents under certain conditions. And motorcycles were being hit by cars in particular. And so the question was, why is that? And how do you collect data on such a thing? Well, you can do case histories. I mean, you can go find out from accident reports, you can get 4 or 5 different motorcycle accidents and then interview all the participants and try to figure out what happened. It's kind of like a critical incident notion. Or you can go into the archives and look at all the accident reports and try to figure out what the commonalities are for those accidents. Or you can even set up an experiment and have somebody come to a stop in a car, look both ways, judge the speed of the motorcycle as it's coming toward you, and find out whether they can judge the speed as you manipulate how fast that motorcycle is coming. In other words, an independent variable in that case. So you can use all of these kinds of techniques to try to find out why motorcycle accidents happen. So we're not limited to one technique in psychology, we can use many. So of these techniques, experimentation is very good, it's very precise, and allows us to infer causality, but it is somewhat artificial. Correlational observation can allow less artificiality, but we cannot infer causality. And some of the qualitative techniques can look at behavior in more naturalistic settings and under conditions that are more realistic, but we have various kinds of problems with those methodologies as well. So those are the methodologies in psychology, and as we go through the rest of the course, you will be learning more about these methodologies as we talk about various research. Thank you.